All right, let's dive into something fascinating today. We're taking a deep dive into the connection between two absolute giants of modern fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
The Elder Scrolls v. Skyrim and HBO's Game of Thrones.
Two massive ones.
They landed on the scene at almost the same moment, back in 2011, right? And just exploded, became these huge cultural forces, each with like a fiercely dedicated fan base.
Definitely. And what we've got here is, well, quite a stack of material research, analysis, data charts, lots of fan discussions to really unpack that relationship.
Okay.
So our mission basically is to pull out the key insights. We want to see if Skyrim truly acted as a kind of playground for Game of Thrones fans.
The playground, yeah.
And what that tells us about how these huge fandoms interact, across different media.
It makes sense to look at them together, though.
Yeah.
I mean, Game of Thrones premiered April 2011, and Skyrim hit shelves, November 2011? So they really rose up at the same time.
Apparently, yeah.
Got Skyrim, this vast open-world RPG known for its deep lore, that incredible modding scene.
Right.
And then Game of Thrones, the super intricate, dragon-filled, epic narrative that, everyone was talking about.
Totally. And with both capturing that fantasy zeitgeist at the same moment, you naturally start wondering, okay, what's the audience dynamic here?
Exactly. That's the central question we're kind of grappling with, isn't it? Did Skyrim specifically function as this, space for Game of Thrones fans?
Did they hop between them?
Yeah, did activity in Skyrim, spike when the show was on? Or off?
Or is the link maybe less about timing and, more about a shared taste for certain fantasy stuff and finding ways to get that fix?
Okay, right here is where it gets really interesting straight away. Those thematic similarities. They just feel like they belong together for so many fans.
Oh, absolutely. The sources we looked at make it really clear that both pull from this deep well of high fantasy tropes.
Wow.
And that leads to these parallels that fans just immediately picked up on, like the literal return of dragons after centuries.
Yes, Alduin in Skyrim, this world-ending dragon threat.
And Daenerys' dragons hatching in Game of Thrones, changing everything. It's right there.
And then there's that looming, mysterious, icy threat from the north.
Yeah.
Those shambling Draugr in the Skyrim tombs, they feel so much like the White Walkers, or the others from the books, pushing down from beyond the wall.
It's that ancient, creeping, cold, evil thing. Definitely a strong parallel.
And there's another one a source is highlighted, which is kind of specific, maybe a bit unusual. Giants and mammoths.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. In Skyrim, you see giants herding mammoths, right?
Right.
And in George R.R. Martin's books, there's mention of giants riding them. It's a weirdly specific combination that, people noticed in both places.
Then you've got the core political drama, the civil conflict,
This one.
Skyrim Civil War, Nords versus the Imperial Legion, these deep cultural political divides. It feels very similar to the War of the Five Kings in Game of Thrones, especially that struggle for the North.
Totally analogous. And underpinning it all, that classic fantasy thing, the mysterious hero, destined to rise, often with some kind of dragon connection.
The last dragonborn.
Exactly, in Skyrim, whose destiny is all tied up with facing Alduin. It mirrors the Azor Ahai prophecy figure in A Song of Ice and Fire.
The sources even point out smaller stuff, little details that just reinforce that feeling of connection.
Like what?
Like court mages functioning kind of like maesters, or the fanatical Thalmor giving off faith militant vibes.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
And even specific revered items.
Right.
Like Wuthrad or Skyforged steel having that legendary quality, kind of like Valyrian steel.
Or the shadowy groups, Dark Brotherhood.
Faceless men, that death cult assassin vibe.
It's all there, but what's really crucial, and the sources emphasize this, is how the fans saw it.
Right, how they reacted.
Yeah, looking at online forums, social media, comment sections, fans were constantly pointing this stuff out. You'd see comments like, okay, this is why I'm obsessed with both, or glad I'm not the only one seeing this.
So it wasn't just a few people noticing. It was widespread.
A really widespread, almost visceral recognition of the kinship. That's powerful qualitative evidence right there.
That perceived connection, that's huge, isn't it? It creates this sort of self-reinforcing loop.
How so?
Well, even if Bethesda didn't sit down and say, let's design Skyrim for GOT fans, the fans saw the resonance and basically just adopted it.
Appropriated it, yeah.
They felt like, okay, this world, this vibe, it feels like a natural extension of the fantasy themes I love in Game of Thrones.
And that feeling, that connection of this fits, It leads us straight to one of the most famous sayings about Skyrim.
There's a mod for that.
Exactly. It's the perfect bridge. You've got the enthusiasm for Game of Thrones themes on one side.
And Skyrim's unique power for user-driven customization on the other.
Fans didn't just notice the similarities, they actively wanted to, enhance them, make Skyrim even more like GOTY.
Okay, and here's a really surprising bit, sort of a historical footnote from the sources. Bethesda Softworks, the Skyrim creators,
Yeah.
they actually did talk about making a Game of Thrones game.
No way.
When? Years before Skyrim came out, apparently. They talked with George R.R. Martin's reps.
Wow. Okay, so they saw the potential early on.
Yeah, there's a quote from Todd Howard in the sources, something like, with A Song of Ice and Fire, we went, we want to do that.
So that confirms it. Strategic recognition right from the start that there was synergy there, a potential audience overlap.
So why didn't it happen? Why did they end up making Skyrim instead of going for the GOTY license?
Well, the sources explain they ultimately chose to stick with their own Elder Scrolls universe, build Skyrim within that.
Why?
The reasoning was basically to avoid creative constraints and, the complexities of licensing. Adapting an existing IP like A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, especially one that was still evolving, it comes with strings attached.
Right. They wanted freedom.
They prioritized the freedom to fully realize their vision within the Elder Scrolls world they knew.
So, looking back at that decision now, through the lens of this deep dive, what does that tell us? How does it frame Skyrim's role?
It's actually fascinating, isn't it? It wasn't that they didn't see the fit with the GOTY audience, they clearly did.
Yeah.
But by choosing creative independence, they kind of inadvertently created a world that was flexible enough, open enough
To become that playground anyway?
Exactly. For a much wider group of fantasy fans, including the GOTY fans they'd originally thought about making a game for. Skyrim's openness, the fact it wasn't tied to one specific external story, let fans shape it and adopt it.
Okay, so if we want to test that playground idea more directly, the tied to Game of Thrones part, the obvious place to look is the hard data.
The quantitative stuff, yeah. What do the player numbers actually say? Platforms like Steam charts.
Right, so Game of Thrones had a pretty regular broadcast schedule for most of its run, April to June mostly.
Yeah, typically. Season 7 was a bit later, July, August 2017, then that long gap.
The long winter.
Yeah. And the final season was April, May 2019.
So the big question, did those key GOTY moments, the premieres, the finales, the long breaks, did they cause noticeable jumps or drops in Skyrim player counts?
Okay, let's look at the data the sources pulled together for both the original Skyrim and the special edition.
What did original Skyrim show? Launched late 2011.
It showed, well, pretty much what you'd expect for an older single-player game, a general long-term decline over the years. You'd see bumps, sure, but they were usually tied to things like new DLC coming out or big Steam sales.
Okay.
So if you look around the GOTY finale, May 2019, the original game averaged maybe 9,000 players. Go back 2 years. During Season 7 in July 2017, it was higher, like 16,600.
So a decline.
But it looks like pretty standard attrition over time, not like a sudden crash because the show ended.
Okay. And the Skyrim Special Edition, that came out late 2016, became the main version for most people.
Right. The SSE data is interesting too. Around that GOTY finale, May 2019, SSE was averaging about 11,600 players. But then, the sources point out, the very next month, June 2019, after GOTY ended, the average actually went up slightly to over 12,500.
So definitely not a drop-off when the show finished.
Not at all. So putting it together, based on this quantitative data, the sources are pretty clear. There's an absence of a direct, sharp, or consistent correlation.
Right. Game of Thrones broadcast events, big moments.
Yeah.
They didn't seem to trigger significant immediate spikes or drops in Skyrim's player numbers.
That's the main takeaway from the player count data. What the sources do point out is what does cause big player surges in Skyrim.
Which is?
Events specific to the game itself. Big Steam sales are huge drivers. The release of new editions, like the Anniversary Edition.
Oh, okay.
They mention an example like a sale in January 2025 causing this massive surge for SSE, getting close to its all-time peak, and this is years after GOTY finished. Those internal game-related things have way more impact on player count than the TV show's schedule did.
And you see that reflected in the long-term stability too, right? The combined player count.
Absolutely. The sources really highlight this. If you combine the players for both original and the special anniversary editions, That number hovered pretty consistently around 50,000 concurrent players.
Wow, 50,000.
Yeah, between roughly 2013 and 2020. And think about that time frame. It completely covers the peak popularity in the entire run of Game of Thrones.
And the big drop-off only happened later.
The significant decline, where it drops below 30,000 concurrent players, that doesn't even start until after 2021, well after GOTY concluded.
So putting that whole data picture together, what does it really tell us about the playground idea?
It strongly suggests that while that thematic link, that feeling of connection is definitely real, Skyrim's incredible staying power, its decades-long retention, it isn't primarily riding on Game of Thrones' schedule.
It stands on its own.
Pretty much. Its longevity is driven by its own core strengths. That massive open world, the sheer freedom it gives you, the constant flow of new stuff from mods, and just being accessible through sales and new additions. Skyrim's appeal is largely self-sustaining.
So the playground's popularity is more about the playground itself than what's happening on the TV next door.
Exactly. The activity in the playground is influenced far more by its own features, its own value, and how easy it is to get into, rather than a schedule happening elsewhere in the fantasy world.
Okay, that's a really clear point from the data side. But if the raw player numbers aren't the main place we see the playground effect tied to GOTY, where do we see that connection most vividly? Where is it undeniable?
This is where the picture really snaps into focus. The connection is most obvious, most tangible, most actively expressed in the modding community.
Ah, yes. Skyrim's modding scene. It's legendary.
It really, really is. The sources describe Skyrim as one of the most modded games, ever. We're talking tens of thousands of mods on Nexus Mods, Steam Workshop.
It's insane.
It's not just a game at this point. For its community, it basically functions as a kind of development platform.
So is that where we see the direct GOTY influence shining through?
Absolutely. Unequivocally. The sources list specific Game of Thrones themed mods. People have made mods like Thrones Expanded to make the Jarls' seats look more like the Iron Throne.
Oh, nice.
There are mods adding GOTY characters as companions. You can run around with Jon Snow or Daenerys or even Tyrion.
Wow.
You can download armor sets inspired by the Night's Watch or grab iconic weapons like Longclaw and Oathkeeper.
And it's not just small cosmetic things, right? Some are huge projects.
Oh, yeah. The sources mention some seriously ambitious stuff, even DLC-sized total conversion projects. There's one called Skyros that's literally trying to recreate the entire continent of Westeros within the Skyrim engine.
That's mind-boggling. Just pure fan dedication.
Incredible effort, driven purely by fan passion for both of these worlds.
And if you read the descriptions for these mods or the comment sections, the desire is explicit, isn't it?
Couldn't be clearer. Mod authors and users talk openly about wanting to create or experience a Game of Thrones-ish feel within Skyrim. They specifically mention wanting elements that evoke that harsh but familiar world from the show. They're actively trying to bake in a small taste of Game of Thrones themes into their Skyrim game.
This really speaks to that idea of prosumerism.
Yeah.
You know, fans aren't just consuming the media, they're actively creating and shaping it.
Which is just incredibly powerful, right? For building a lasting community, giving people a sense of ownership.
Yeah.
And the sources even note that the modding scene for the special edition has seen this huge boom recently. Downloads apparently quadrupled between 2022 and 2024. SSE mods are now like 65% of all downloads on Nexus.
Why the boom now?
Partly better hardware making it easier to run more mods. But a crucial factor mentioned is the introduction of simpler collections on Nexus mods.
Ah, making it easier to install big mod packs.
Exactly. It lowers the barrier to entry. Makes it much easier for more casual players to jump into a heavily modded experience, including those GOTY-themed setups.
So more people can access and enjoy these fan-made GOTY crossovers.
Precisely. And this constant flow of user-generated content, fueled by these cross-fandom passions like the GOTY link, is a massive reason why Skyrim stays so relevant and engaging. Years after release, years after GOTY ended, it's a powerful, self-sustaining engine for keeping the game alive.
Okay, so this feels like the key distinction then. The quantitative data, the player counts, didn't show that direct link to the GOTY schedule.
Right.
But this modding activity, this is the qualitative proof. It shows fans literally reshaping Skyrim to fit their Game of Thrones enthusiasm.
Yeah, it makes the modding scene a much stronger indicator of that playground effect than just looking at raw player counts, which are bouncing around because of sales or whatever.
This is where you see the active merging of the fandoms.
It's where the audience's creative energy, their desire to blend these fantasy worlds, is most visibly and actively happening within the game itself.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit then. How does this relationship fit into the bigger picture? The whole fantasy entertainment ecosystem is not just GOTY influencing Skyrim, is it? It feels more symbiotic.
Absolutely. The sources definitely place this interaction within that broader context. You have to remember the inherent appeal of fantasy RPGs like Skyrim.
Right.
They offer these rich stories, deep lore, immersive gameplay, and crucially significant player agency. You get to make choices, influence the world.
High replayability.
Exactly. And Skyrim's sheer scale, its true open world, the freedom it gives you, it creates this kind of generic, epic canvas that appeals broadly beyond just one specific fandom.
We know media convergence and cross fandoms are just a thing now, a big thing.
A huge thing. The sources point out gaming is bigger than film or music now, entertainment-wise, and fantasy and sci-fi, consistently top genres.
So fans mixing and matching is normal.
It's totally normal. Fans naturally blend elements from properties they love. It explains that tendency for GOTY fans to instinctively look for complementary experiences, and Skyrim was just perfectly positioned to be that experience.
So Skyrim wasn't just like riding GOTY's coattails based on its broadcast schedule.
Oh.
It was more like a crucial complementary piece of content.
That's the nuance the sources really drive home. Skyrim is less a direct short-term beneficiary of GOTY's timing and more a really valuable companion piece within the whole fantasy landscape.
Right.
Fans sought it out for that immersion, maybe especially during those long GOTY waits between seasons.
Or just for a different kind of interaction.
Yeah, an interactive way to engage with those familiar high fantasy themes. It's definitely a relationship of mutual reinforcement within the genre.
And that split, we saw the quantitative data showing no direct schedule link versus the really strong qualitative evidence from themes and modding that really highlights this nuanced relationship, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows both properties tap into a shared demographic of people who just deeply appreciate high fantasy archetypes.
Rock.
But it's Skyrim's inherent design, its adaptability, and especially its modding community that allows it to effectively capture, absorb, and then retain this audience over the very, very long term, regardless of exactly when Game of Thrones happened to be airing.
The sources added another interesting wrinkle too, mentioning reports that the GOTY showrunners might have deliberately toned down fantasy elements in the show itself.
Yeah, that's an interesting point raised. The idea is maybe to appeal to a broader, more mainstream audience that might be put off by, too much overt magic or prophecy.
So if that's true, how might that have affected the Skyrim connection?
Well, it could have made Skyrim, with its very obvious dragons, explicit magic systems, ancient prophecies, unambiguous fantasy setting, and even more appealing alternative or complement.
For fans wanting the full dose.
Exactly. For fans who are specifically seeking that deeper, more traditional, undiluted fantasy immersion, maybe after watching a GOTY episode that felt more political drama than high fantasy epic.
And we have to remember the fundamental difference in the medium itself, right?
Yeah.
A passive linear TV show versus an active open world RPG. That's key to Skyrim's independent draw.
Absolutely crucial. Unlike just watching a story unfold, however great it is, an open-world RPG like Skyrim offers you unique player agency.
You're in it.
You're not just observing, you are living within that world. You're actively shaping your own experience, your own story to some extent.
That's a fundamentally different appeal.
It's a distinct and enduring appeal that helps retain audiences long after a linear narrative like GOTY concludes. The playground isn't just a place to see things that remind you of GOTY, it's a place to act, to explore, to create within a similar thematic space.
That interactive strength lets Skyrim keep its hold independently, and maybe even absorb fans looking for more active fantasy hit after the show ended.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive then. The qualitative evidence, those unmistakable shared themes, and especially that incredibly active modding community literally building GOTY content inside Skyrim, that strongly supports the idea of Skyrim as a playground for Game of Thrones fans.
Definitely. The desire and the action are clearly there from the fans. However, the quantitative data, the player counts versus the GOTY schedule, that does not show a direct immediate correlation. So the relationship is better understood as, well, symbiotic. happening within this broader fantasy ecosystem. It's driven by shared genre appeal, sure, but also by Skyrim's own powerful intrinsic strengths. Its adaptability, its modding scene, which are just incredibly effective at absorbing and holding on to that shared audience for the long haul.
And the implications of figuring this out are pretty significant, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. It really highlights the power of shared genre archetypes in creating organic audience crossover between different kinds of media. And maybe even more critically, it underscores the immense value of user-generated content, of having dedicated modding communities. They can extend the life and appeal of games, of interactive media, far, far beyond what the original creators might have planned.
So for creators, the lesson is?
For creators, understanding this means recognizing that building open-ended worlds that can become platforms for fan expression. That's not just a nice-to-have feature. It can be a really powerful strategy for building lasting engagement, for letting audiences bring their diverse interests into your world.
Okay, so considering all of that, here's something for you, the listener, to mull over. What other massive fandoms out there, spanning books, shows, movies, might be finding a home right now, expressing themselves within adaptable, existing game worlds like Skyrim?
And maybe looking forward. How might new properties in the Game of Thrones universe like House of the Dragon continue to influence or interact with these vibrant, established communities like Skyrim's modding scene in the years ahead?
Definitely something to think about.